Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. As a lover of food and somebody who also is a huge horror, literature, and film fan, I was so excited to get a chance to talk to my next guest. My guest today is Dr. Alessandra Pino, who is an expert on the intersections of the Gothic in food and cultural memory. Alessandra was born in Hampstead, London, to an Italian mother and a Venezuelan diplomat father, and she grew up in several different countries. She holds a BA in English Literature and an MA in Translation Studies and a PhD in Food, Cultural Memory, and the Gothic. Alessandra is a co-author of the soon-to-be-out A Gothic Cookbook, which digs into food themes and motifs in a series of classic and contemporary movie novels from the 19th century to the present day. And she is also the co-host of Fear Feasts, a podcast which analyzes the horror genre, films, and books through the lens of food. And I have to say, I'm a really big fan of Fear Feast. It's a great podcast, and I just am giddy with delight when every episode comes in. I now want to take you to my conversation with the charming Dr. Alessandra Pino. Here we go. Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. Today I'm talking with Dr. Alessandra Pino, who is an expert on intersections of the Gothic food and cultural memory. She is a co-host of the Fear Feast podcast, one of my favorite podcasts that I listen to with bated breath every 2 weeks when it comes out, and the co-author of the upcoming book, A Gothic Cookbook. Alessandra, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Dean. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm always so happy to talk about food and horror, so thank you.
Oh, just a thrill to listen to that magical voice. Thank you for being on the podcast. It's so wonderful. I mentioned I listen to the podcast every 2 weeks. I wait for it. I pounce on it the minute it comes out. So I'm a huge fan of this person. So I want you all to know that, and you have to listen to the podcast as well. I'm going to have links to it in the bio, so you can immediately go to it as well. Don't listen to my podcast. Listen to that podcast.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we actually have a passion for horror and food, both I and Vanessa. And it's so sincere, and we sometimes forget to press the record button when we start doing the podcast, and we're half an hour in talking about things that have maybe not even related to the topic that we're going to do for that session, and we're like, oh my gosh, we need to start recording. But it's just the enthusiasm of having someone to talk to about just my favorite thing, which is horror films, spooky films. I have a passion for, in particular, kind of the supernatural. So not so gory, more as kind of ghostly, if that makes sense. Yeah. And the connection with food. And Vanessa Backer is my co-host for Fear Feasts podcast. And I did a book with my wonderful friend Ella Buchan, and she's the co-author with me of A Gothic Cookbook, which is due to be out next year. So we're very excited about that.
Can you tell us a little bit about where you're from and where you live now?
Sure. I was born in London, in Hampstead, and my father is Venezuelan. My mother is Italian, from very near Naples. So I had no choice really but to love food from a very early age. I think that's how it started. I traveled around a lot because my father was a diplomat, and I lived in Italy. I lived in Venezuela, in Caracas. I got to eat the most wonderful food. And then something incredible happened. I got a job in a Michelin-starred restaurant working with a chef, and I was able to see very close up how food worked from the minute it entered the door of the restaurant to the moment it was on people's plates. And that was a real privilege to be able to see that. And I think it influenced a lot of how I see food, of my idea of food, and love, the darkness of food as well, and how food operates, in a kind of global market, and the things behind that are both positive and negative. And I did a PhD on food and cultural memory, specifically from the point of view of the Gothic. So yes, my life has been very much intertwined with food and darkness and especially horror. So I made everything kind of dovetail. I made it dovetail.
Now, I like to ask my guests, and you've already touched on this, what are some of your earliest food memories that kind of have stuck with you through the years?
I think the really weird thing that happened to me as I was doing my PhD, and my PhD, basically, I specialize in sugar and
Hmm.
in Cuba. So the history of Cuba and sugar, the plantations. And as I was working on the thesis, I suddenly got kind of flashback to a moment when I must have been around 7 years old. And I remember I had an English babysitter. Bear in mind, my mom is Italian, my dad is Venezuelan. They would speak Spanish and Italian to each other. So I grew up in a non-English speaking household. I learned English when I was 5 years old, when I went to primary school. And I had a babysitter. And I remember she would always put sugar in her tea. So at the age of 7, I was kind of trying to have tea and putting sugar in my tea. And I remember my dad said to me, "We don't do that." And I thought, what do you mean? I didn't say anything, but I just thought to myself, well, I'm doing something wrong here. I'm putting sugar in tea. What does he mean? We don't do that. And anyway, as I was learning more about sugar production and the separation that exists between countries that produce food sometimes and then how they reach the Western world, let's put it that way, there's a kind of big void, and we don't get to see the modalities of production, the conditions of labor, and that kind of detachment, that void really fascinated me. And I think as I was studying about it and I was putting two and two together in order to write my thesis, that was kind of one of the earliest food memories that I got. And it was kind of negative because it was about, not putting something in a drink. And I remember it fondly on the other hand, because I think it inspired a lot of what I do now.
We've had a guest on the show who's written a book about sugar, Neil Buttery, The Dark History of Sugar. Are you familiar with that book?
I am familiar. He is actually a friend of mine. And at the
Oh, no
time when he
way.
was, at the time when he was writing this book, I said, Neil, I'm writing um, my thesis, and it's about dark food. So the idea of this, as I said, the kind of void that exists between sites of production and then how we buy things from supermarkets, and it's kind of difficult to envisage how we would eat something knowing where it actually came from and how it was produced, the history and the ties with colonialism. And he said, well, I'm writing this book. And I said, you see, we were meant to be friends. So yeah, he interviewed me for his podcast and I told him all about A Gothic Cookbook. So he is a great scholar and yes, a very good friend as well. Very interesting
Yeah.
topic. I've always been attracted by the dark side of food, like the dark things that we don't know, things that we have to ignore in order to enjoy things like a cake. Perhaps you wouldn't enjoy a cake as much if you knew all the ingredients and where they came from and how they were produced, the history behind them, and its kind of darker ties to the world.
Now, how about horror? Now, I've loved horror since I can remember, and I've always been attracted to horror. How about you? Did you have a love of it when you were young?
When I was young, I unfortunately, I think I was a bit too young. I entered a room where Jaws was being watched, and I immediately got someone kind of swooping me up, taking me away, but it was too late, Dean, because I'd heard the music. And that music stayed with me for years and years and years. And I think I watched my first proper horror a little bit later on. And I'm born in 1979. I was born in 1979. And I think the first film I saw, I was a little bit older. Maybe I was, I don't know, 12. And I watched The Woman in Black, the 1983 version. And
Yes. Oh,
since
yes.
then, it's been a love story between me and horror, all kinds of horror, but I have a predilection for kind of the supernatural and ghostly.
I do as well. Now, I know that I'm sorry, I'll cut this bit out.
Don't
I'll
worry.
mark this as a point to edit. You have a BA in English Literature and an MA in Translation Studies and a PhD in Food Cultural Memory and the Gothic. Can you talk about your choice of educational degrees and how you came to apply for these fields of studies?
Yeah, I was fascinated by the fact that it's quite hard to learn a language. And I was lucky because my mum taught me Italian, and she spoke Italian at home, and my dad would speak to me in Spanish. So I had those two languages in my head. But I've always very strongly admired people who can learn a completely new language. I think that's amazing. And I thought, actually, I'm not really able to do that. I didn't want to. I wanted to explore the ones that I already knew and the background and the culture. So I did that. I did just that at university. And I was fascinated by interpretation and translation, thinking, well, if I know the languages, then I can definitely translate and be an interpreter, no problem. Actually, those are completely different skills at which I failed quite miserably. The literary translation, the poetry, that kind of thing, perfect. I loved doing that and I was good at that. But I wasn't getting many jobs in that field. So I kind of had to turn to the more corporate. And that was something that I wasn't attracted to. So I carried on. And that's when I thought, let me just really do what I truly, truly love. And that is try to combine horror with food. And the idea of cultural memory, I had the most wonderful supervisor, Dr. Lucy Bond at the University of Westminster, who managed to kind of give me just the general view of how things fit together in the world when you're analyzing a text. So it's not just about history, it's about why this kind of history now. Why are we making films about the Second World War? What does it mean? How are we reinterpreting them? And what is the horror in that? So what are the elements that we want to pick from that to focus on because they're relevant today? What is it about the Cold War that persists in our minds? And so there are so many reinterpretations of that. And I just think anything that you pick out has to do with cultural memory and the way that we re-envisage our history and our past in order to move ahead in a different way, in a way that we want to. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that was what fascinated me about cultural memory. And of course, the Gothic side of things and why there is this dark side also fits together with history and that kind of reasoning for me. So that was my course of studies. I also recently did an online course on parapsychology because my idea, Dean, is to eventually just, leave everything behind and become a ghostbuster. That's my actual dream. And I hope Vanessa joins me on this.
I have a good
journey,
contact.
but
I have a good contact with you. For you. We've had a guest on the show. I could send you his information. He's a local author, and he's both a parapsychology expert who's been on television and such, and he's also an expert on chocolate.
No, this
Yeah,
could be just the perfect person for me then. Please do share the content.
yeah. I'll send you that information later
That'd be
on. I think you'll
amazing.
like them. You talked about in your bio dark academia. Can we talk about that a bit? Because that sounds wonderful. I have all these ideas in my head of what that means. So what does it mean in reality?
I don't know if it's relevant to, I think I play a little bit with that term because, dark academia is more something I think to do with, as soon as you say that, you think big grand halls, the darkness of kind of books and dusty bookshelves and Harry Potter, etc. So I'm kind of taking that with a twist and just saying what I do is I analyze the darkness of food. So for me, that's dark academia. So I have my idea of what a dark kitchen is, of what dark food is, and so that's how I use it. But it may not be everyone's interpretation.
So you've worked in restaurants before, and you have some history there. Can you talk about your time in restaurants and what you did?
Yes, so I worked in a Michelin-starred restaurant for an Italian chef, and it was like a second family. I learned nearly everything I know about food, probably there, and the love for food. I saw chefs working. I was his PA and then head of communications, and I did research. And so it was just a wonderful experience where I could see close up how people handled food and in just such an excellent way that yes, I think that really stayed with me in terms of how I developed with my own research following that and my passion for food, because it just brings such joy to people. And the restaurant had customers that were so loyal and they would have done anything to eat there. And so that just made me start viewing food slightly differently, the preparation of food, the sourcing food, and everything that's, you know, ethically correct that goes on behind the scenes. It's very much like a theater. So I loved watching the chefs work and like the build up and then how things would come out, and you would enter into a state of absolute calm in the restaurant itself, whereas in the kitchen it wasn't that it wasn't calm, but it was obviously a completely different and hot environment. So I
Yeah.
just loved that transition, and I loved working in between. So I'd organize events. I was involved with the research and just anything to do with the food and the people who were wonderful.
You're the co-author of A Gothic Cookbook, which digs into food themes and motifs in a series of classic contemporary novels from the 19th century to the present day. Can you talk to me a little bit about the book and how you conceptualized it and how it came to kind of be a reality with your co-writer?
Yes, it was a very odd story because it was my birthday and I received a package, and it was a huge book, a wonderful book by Edgar Allan Poe, or cloth bound, black. And my friend Ella had sent it to me, and I said, Ella, this is such a wonderful present. And she said, Ali, I was looking all over the place because I know that you're doing Gothic studies and food, and I wanted to find something about that, you know, together, but there just is nothing. There's no Gothic cookbook. There's no, and I said, Ella, why don't we write one? Because she's a wonderful food writer and journalist. And I said, well, why don't we do that? And she said, great. So we did it. It took us a while to kind of think through everything and make it become a reality, because initially I pitched the idea and to a few kind of agencies, agents, publishers, and they were like, this is so niche, this is like not really up my alley, this is not. And so we got no, no, no. And then we thought, okay, well, and Ella had the brilliant idea of going to Unbound, which is a crowdfunding platform. And the next day we received a response, and they were so enthusiastic, and we were just transported by the enthusiasm. And that's how it all kind of started. And the idea behind it is that there are 13 chapters, and each chapter is dedicated to a Gothic novel or story. And we take the ingredients in each story and just create recipes inspired by it. And there's a short essay in each chapter just explaining kind of what lies behind the food, what the food is doing in this book. And it's just very original and new. There's never before been a Gothic cookbook. This is the first one in the world. We're very proud of that. And yeah, it's just a brilliant opportunity. Ella is a recipe developer. I kind of come up more with the theory behind it because I'm, let's say, an academic. And so that's how we make the perfect team. Illustrations are by Lee Henry, and they're wonderful. And I think, yes, they are absolutely fantastic. So yes, that's how that all started.
Can you give us a little taste of some of the stories and recipes in the book?
Yes, one of the first things I thought about when thinking about horror and food, you know, as I said before, it's not about thinking about food which is disgusting or gross, and it's, you know, what you kind of get Halloween style, you know, eyes popping out and sweets in the shape of guts and things like this. So we're talking
Yeah.
about good recipes, traditional recipes, because the ingredients in these novels and in these stories and the dishes that are sometimes described are normal dishes. You know, if you take Dracula, for example, when Jonathan Harker is getting closer and closer to the castle, he has the paprikash dish, and he even makes a note says note, you know, make note of the recipe for Mina. And that's a very moving moment, actually. That's in the first page of the book. So food is actually quite pivotal to the plot. As he's getting closer to the castle, he feels stranger and stranger, and he thinks, this is the paprikash, this is the spicy food that I'm not used to, being from the West, and I'm getting closer and closer to this unknown territory, this wild territory. And that's what it is. So he can hear wolves howling, dogs barking, and he attributes it to the Hungarian stew. And so I thought, isn't that fascinating? We can take these ingredients, make our own version of them, and explain what food is doing in the books. Likewise with Frankenstein, you know, the idea of this monster who is vegetarian and who excludes himself from being like other men, like other people. He's not worthy of eating meat. And so he says, I will eat berries and acorns. this role of kind of vegetarianism, which then ties in with Mary Shelley and the idea of vegetarianism, which is very important at that moment in time, where you get a lot of change in how food is being produced and the technology behind food. That again is a whole other discourse. And I thought there is so much going on with the Gothic and food. And then on a wider level, with horror or horrifying elements in food. And so you get the two very, very close together. I think what really works when it comes to food is that we have a kind of empathy, because we can feel at one with the character. If Jonathan Harker is feeling sick, if he's feeling anxious and he thinks it's to do with the spices, well, maybe you might start feeling a little bit hot as well. Your tongue might start kind of wanting to I don't know, lick your lips and feel like you need a bit more water, a bit more hydration. You might feel sad, just like Frankenstein's monster, because he can't enjoy the food that people enjoy. He has to just kind of pick berries off a tree, and he's such a big monster as well. You feel like he needs more nourishment, and actually this is really interesting to think, oh, he needs more nourishment, and we associate that with meat eating, because that isn't necessarily the case. That's something that we've arrived to in our in this moment in time, where we think this is what we need protein. Where is protein? What are other sources of protein? The monster was already kind of exchanging that and saying, this is what I'll do. I'll punish myself by not eating meat. And then of course you get other novels where there's a bit more subtlety, and you get things like Jane Eyre and all the kind of symbology behind the lack of eating, the idea of hunger. So it's food, but it's also the lack of food and what that does, and how that moves the plot along and makes people make certain decisions as well.
I wanted to talk next about the podcast, because I know you from the podcast, and I'm such a enormous fan of it. How did you conceptualize? I mean, how did this come together for you? Because you didn't just do it on your own. This is done with another, your co-anchor, and your first season that I've listened to has had such wonderful choices. And I was, whenever I hear about horror, I tend to hear about, Chucky and Freddy Krueger, blah blah blah, Saw movies, and that's all fine and good. But like, you've been talking about some movies from, when I was young, before your time period even, and like Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, then contemporary films like House of the Devil, and Angel Heart from the 80s. And you juxtapose them often with the novels, which I love, because I've in all cases I've read both the book and seen the movie, and I love how you tackle that, because you guys really do read the books and go into them and juxtapose them. And I didn't even know, like, The Devil's Advocate had a book.
Yeah.
And I was surprised. I'm like, now I got to go get it. So how did this all come together for you guys?
Our aim is to make people watch more and more horror and read horror.
A little work.
I just started A Gothic Cookbook. We were kind of promoting it, and Vanessa Backer, who is also known as Food in Books, has her own blog, asked me to come on her podcast and talk about Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, the book. And so that's where we talked the first time. Then we talked about Dracula on another episode, and we kind of became friends very quickly. All we would do is talk about horror, and then that kind of turned into more deeper discussions about humanity and why people do certain things. And Vanessa is an avid reader, whereas I'm more on the film side. And just like you, I was surprised. Sometimes she'd say, Ali, have you read this book? This is what this film is based on. And I'm like, I didn't know that even existed. And so that's how we got together, and we started Fear Feasts, and we never looked back. I mean, we can't wait to record. We do every 2 weeks simply because we need the time. And to be honest, if she already has read the books. She knows, she's like giving me time to read the books most of the time, because she's there before I have. She suggested Jack Sparks. She's kind of really, really on it when it comes to the book side. And I love that, because I can then really compare the details. And that's where my interest lies is kind of seeing, and sometimes the author of the script is the same as the author of the book, which is fascinating. And I'm like, well, why on
Oh,
earth? Why on earth would you know, David Seltzer, who wrote the script for The Omen and wrote the book, why is he changing people's names? That's so annoying. And so we have a laugh about that. But some other details change. And sometimes the films come out much later than the book. So it's interesting to see how the cultural context changes and what they decide to change. So in The Omen, for example, which came out in the 70s, you have a set of kind of cultural reference. And then you get into the 2006 version, kind of the comets arriving and all of that, but it's not so much about the European Union, it's about 9/11, it's about the tsunami. So you get different political references. Isn't that fascinating how you can change a book? You can change the meaning is the same, the devil is the devil, but then how the devil manifests itself is different. And I just think that is the most interesting and fascinating thing, because you get an idea of what's important to us now. What are we looking at now? What are the tragedies for us now? And how are things panning out for us now? And this kind of persistent interest with, for example, the war, maintaining the memory alive of the Holocaust, of the Cold War, look what's happening now. And so you get, I don't know, it's like watching things happen in real time through fiction. And it's always great to kind of read the books, and they are really well written as well. So the script, and I like the book The Omen, for example. Same thing with The Exorcist. I don't know what to choose. The book is just as good as the film. So William Friedkin directed the film, but it's based on a book by William Peter Blatty, and there are some such great differences, and you see them in food. Well, I'm always looking at the food, obviously, and that's where Vanessa and I always are looking at that. And so I just think, why is there curry in the book and there's no emphasis on that in the films? Like, what were they trying to say about the mum? The fact that she was, what does that mean? She was out kind of meditating. Is she like a 70s style woman that doesn't have a grounding in, what is being a proper mother? Is this a kind of punishment? You go a different direction, also thanks to that food changing. And the food choices, are very, very interesting book compared to film.
I really loved, I loved all the episodes, but I thought some of them I just wanted to get up and applaud afterwards, although I was driving, which would be horrible if I did that. So, but
That would be horrific. Yeah.
Yeah, but I loved your Rosemary's Baby one, because that's a favorite of mine. I've seen it like 7 times, and I love it every time. I never get tired of it. It's just one of those films you can watch again and again. And I loved your breakdown of it, and plus the book as well. And I just thought you did such a great job. And then when you did House of the Devil, I thought nobody had seen that. Because I love that film.
I
Yeah,
made
it's a
Vanessa
great film.
watch it.
It's so
She's
good.
like,
And
Ali, I'm not scared by it. I'm like, well, but still.
it's still good. Yeah, it's a really good film. That's such a good job.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm a massive fan of Ira Levin. I don't know if you've read A Kiss Before Dying. If you haven't, and not many people kind of have. Okay, that might be one of my favorite books. I love Rosemary's Baby, obviously, but A Kiss Before Dying, I don't know. I just couldn't put it down. Brilliant. I love that style of writing. I thought there's a lot of, it's kind of the same, the book and the film. But Mia Farrow, who also we see in The Omen again, the 2006 version, and Mia Farrow is just, I love the way she's just great in horror. She's just got the perfect everything to be in horror. And she's Mrs. Baylock in the 2006 Omen. Now she's Rosemary in Rosemary's Baby. And I don't know with another actress if it would have been the same. So sometimes the actors are really important too. But everything that happens with the food is so significant. It's so important. And for example, in A Gothic Cookbook, we do some really great recipes inspired by Rosemary's Baby, because yes, you get the gross milkshakes and we don't know what's in them and they're green, but then you also get the chupe chileno, you get the chalk, we've called them the chalk mousses because they're white chocolate and they've got the chalky undertaste, so we play a little bit with that, but they're delicious really. And so yes, I just love that there's some issue of trust in food, because Rosemary not only can't trust her own husband, And she says that right at the start. She's like, he's an actor. Do we know who we can trust? Who knows if when they're acting or when they're being real? And then that kind of filters down into all the food. And he's giving her this mousse, and that's what makes her have that nightmare kind of slash reality. But the food plays a big role in also the neighbors coming by. Is this hospitality? Is this a nice neighbor, or is it me being too trusting and too open with someone that I don't really know? And so, yes, I don't open my door to any neighbors, Dean. I don't know what you think about that, or if you do the same, but it's just not worth it.
No, I tend to be. My neighbors don't find me very friendly, so it's not really a problem I have.
They haven't read Rosemary's Baby. That's why.
I have a skeleton looking through the blinds in my house, so people tend to not bother me.
I have a skull above my shelf above a door, so that makes sense.
I know that this last season was you're going into your second season, correct?
Correct. We have a really great guest coming up soon for our net. You might know him. I can't say anything, or Vanessa. Actually, when this comes out, that will already be out, won't it? So we might be able to say that the guest was Jameson Ridenauer, who has the Palimpsest podcast, again, about haunted houses. So he came on and to talk to us about the haunting of Hill House. So this before anyone else, Dean. And it was the greatest discussion. Like he is a scholar himself. He does podcasting, and so he's also a fan of ghosts and the supernatural. So it was really good.
Ooh. Are you already thinking about other seasons, or am I being too greedy by asking?
Oh, we've planned them all out. Vanessa she's very structured like that. And, I just think there's so much to kind of to squeeze in one. And we just said, look, let's just do it season by season. We put in what we think, at the time is maybe 5, 6, 7 episodes. And then we can go back to that same season, because I was like, there's so many more books about and films about the devil. How do we do this?
Right.
And she's like, no, we can just have a little taster. So each season is kind of a taster of, and then we can do more and more. But we're going to have dysfunctional families. We're going to have, or maybe I shouldn't say all these things, Dean, because Vanessa will tell me off.
Oh
no,
I don't want to get you in trouble.
Don't reveal all our secrets, all Fearfeast secrets.
Well, I hope I have a hope that, or I hope I dare hope that in the future you tackle at some point The Wicker Man, which is my favorite film. And I when I make jam for my friends, I always use Summerisle labels for the jam and everything. And I think I even have a tea line that you can buy online that are all Summerisle themed.
That is brilliant. And did you enjoy a film like Midsummer then, for example? What do you think? Okay, great.
I liked it quite a bit. It was one of the things, like, it's funny because I think I could say to you and any fans of horror that I'm like, I enjoyed it. But my wife was horrified by my liking of it. Like, what is wrong with you? I'm like, it's a good film. I'm sorry, it's good.
A bit like Hereditary. It kind of leaves you with, I went with a friend of mine called Nikki, bless her, and I think she said to me, I don't think I'll be able to eat or sleep for a couple of days after watching this film, because also when you watch it at the cinema, it's quite dark. So it kind of stays with you a little bit longer, but they're such great films. Yes. So I said Midsummer just because it reminds me slightly, obviously, of The Wicker Man for obvious reasons.
Oh, yeah, very much. Yeah, you can't miss that. And then also, I mean, there's The Dark Secret of Harvest Home, based on the Thomas Tryon book, Harvest Home, which is a lot of food comes up in that too. Just want to mention. But it's funny you mentioned that not having a horror film affect you so much, because I don't really get affected by horror films that badly. But when I watched the film Dunkirk, you're talking about history and how we think of it, and how, in films, how it is portrayed. Dunkirk, I think I got PTSD from Dunkirk.
Yes. And now, Dean, actually, on that note, because you actually mentioned what were one of your first food memories, and I told you my first food memory that I can remember, and I was already quite old, really, because I was 6 or 7. But then speaking to my grandmother, who's no longer with me, unfortunately, she used to tell me a lot about the war, the Second World War. And
Yeah.
she never used to eat sardines. And I always said, and I didn't think anything of it. And then one day she said, well, you want to know about food and the war? I was already starting my research. And she said to me, well, I don't eat sardines because when the soldiers used to wash up on the shore in Salerno, which is kind of on the coast where we're from, near about 30 minutes from Naples, they used to see the corpses of the soldiers, being eaten by the sardines. And so after she saw that, she could never eat a sardine after that. So that for example, is a food memory, quite a dark food memory connected to history and to things. And you don't really see that. That's just something quite personal that she told me, and that could be a good element to kind of, if anyone was ever doing a film, I'd probably kind of insert something like that to make it kind of more real. You know, you get writers like Elio Vittorini, and they talk about Sicily and the fact that all they had was oranges, and that's what fascinates me. You have an idea of Italy so abundant with so much prosperity when it comes to food, and this idea, but that was created outside of Italy mainly,
Yeah.
by writers and food writers who would have a summer home there. But you know, in periods, especially obviously during the war and post-war, people were eating always the same thing. There was an extreme scarcity. You didn't get that much variety. It wasn't how we see in the films. It wasn't all of that, you know. So that is, yeah, that's what stays with me in the end, and why I do my research.
Yeah, I mean, when we think of Italy, we think of La Dolce Vita or something like that. We don't think of anything like that. We tend to just think of, like, it always has to be kind of overkill. But then, of course,
Yeah.
I've heard lots of guests on that talk about the scarcity issue, especially after the war, and
Yes.
that really sticks with you.
Yeah, you used to get ersatz. I don't know how to say ersatz dishes. So you would replace, for example, if you were having soup and maybe you were making it with rabbit soup, you didn't have the rabbit, so you would only put the herbs that you would put with the rabbits, but without the rabbit, and that would be your rabbit, kind of fake rabbit soup, and that was just a normal thing. It was very vegetarian, not all this meat. Then the whole meat scenario scene comes in with a bit more force when, after people migrate to America and there is more availability, so then you get meat kind of everywhere.
Do you have any food writers that have inspired you over the years, or any kind of food? I don't want to just have it be sequestered to food writers. I'll use the term broadly, food celebrities. Are there anybody that you really enjoy, that you like to watch their TV shows or listen to or read their books, that you really like the work?
Oh, let me think. Yeah, I watch and I read so much, and I like bits of everything. Um, there was a reader I was actually reading quite recently, a book. Let me just see if I can get it. It's MFK Fisher.
Oh yeah, a local woman.
Yeah. So How to Cook a Wolf and things like that. I love anything that has a bit of history attached to it, so that you get the recipe, but there's an explanation, and the explanation is personal. So yeah, I really enjoy books like that. There's a really good book I read recently, and I like it because there is kind of a reference to Brexit, and
Yeah.
you kind of get this idea of what happens in the UK after Brexit, but very gently, through how friendships evolve and relationships, and also food. And it's The Yellow Kitchen by Margot Vialeron. It really stayed with me because it was a very gentle book, but also it gave you the idea of kind of the force of Brexit happening. And yeah, I like that combination. I like where food plays a role, and it's not, it doesn't have to be very elaborate descriptions or anything, but it gives you a sense of like that wanting to be together and being with friends, and then the difficulty of something like Brexit happening, and then what happens after that. So that kind of writing I really enjoy as well.
I mean, and this is probably an unfair question to ask you, but I mean, what are some of your favorite horror films, if you don't mind talking about that a bit?
No, I love anything like The Possession, anything where someone is being possessed and their behavior changes, and it starts changing slowly. And you see the dynamics in the family changing as well. And I first kind of got into this type of film and book as well, but Kim Newman wrote a book about a family who was being infested and how the dynamics started changing. And then I started getting into that kind of idea of the poltergeist. And like, I like the film Poltergeist as well. And
That's food bits in that as well.
yeah, there is. And things take place a lot in the kitchen. But if I have to tell you, like, one of the films that I've watched the most, and it probably won't be a choice that people will go, oh yeah, quite the opposite, because it's not really a well-loved film, but I just love Paranormal Activity, for example. I just think that's a
Yeah.
great film. And
Yeah.
lots of the scenes take place in the kitchen. You have so much to work with when it comes with cutlery, when it comes with fridge scenes and, jump scares behind the fridge, and cupboards opening, plates flying out. There's a lot going on in kitchens. And even a gentle film, like, I say gentle, but like Maggie, where we're talking about zombification, nice kitchen scenes there as well. And we covered The Dark and the Wicked as well in Fear Feasts, because that's one of my favorites as well. So where you see that chopping, and yeah, anything like that, where there's a family and then a gradual kind of infestation of some sort, or something is taking over and people are realizing that something's not quite right. I just love that build up. I think it's great.
It's funny because kitchens in movies, they almost become tropes in and of themselves because, for instance, I mean, God, I don't know how many times I've seen this. The protagonist opens the refrigerator door. So the refrigerator door is on the right-hand side, blocking our view. Now we know the minute that door is closed, there's going to be a monster or a zombie or a ghoul or whatever there, right? That's always going to
Yeah.
happen. Or they don't, and then you're like, oh, you had that kind of almost jump scare, but they teased you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or garbage
uh,
disposal.
yeah. Yeah. I think there are more elements in the kitchen, aren't there? And it's where you feel more relaxed, and it's where you're like, well, I can hide behind a table, or I won't see something behind a fridge. So I'm working on a theory called fridge theory at the moment, which is precisely about that. Because we open the fridge, something might be in the fridge, like in Ghostbusters, or you might get an idea of someone by what they have in the fridge. Even in Angel Heart, when people keeping drugs in the fridge or whatever, you get to know who that person. In fact, my theory is more like a fridge is like a second body for us. We're eventually going to consume the items that are in the fridge. They're going to be in us. We are fridgified in that way. It goes through us. So it's like having an alter ego. People hide things in the fridge and in the freezer because normally people won't go and look for them there. You might get, just that flat. Even Bridget Jones, when she opens the fridge and you're like, oh, what is this character about? Like, what is, tell me more. Open the fridge and you get to find out what that character is about. Are they OCD in the sense, they have to keep everything in color-coded order? Are they just have one beer and that's it? So they have expired milk. What does that say about them? So yeah, there's a lot that can be done when it comes to kitchens and fridges in particular. And there's a group called Romancing the Gothic, and I do talks on that platform a lot, and I talk about the cruelty of consumption in one of them, and I think I go through fridges there, because even in It there's a fridge, in The Joker there's a fridge. They may not be, The Joker isn't necessarily a horror film, but you get horrifying elements in that, and the fridge might play a role, when he kind of climbs in the fridge at the end.
And cannibalism, I mean, gets such play in horror films, and that can be even done so subtly, and it's something that really horrifies and disturbs people. People still are very much like, the thought of it can be so disturbing that people won't even watch a film because they can't handle the thought of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that something like that, for example, the metaphor of cannibalism is a great metaphor for trauma, because if you are kind of growing in a traumatic environment and that trauma perpetuates, which is what horror is all about, the perpetuation of something, right? And something that is kind of unsettling and disruptive, within that. So something has to change. And with cannibalism, there's a great film, for example, We Are What We Are, I think it's called. And at the end, the cannibalism remains, but you understand it. They are, if you grow a cannibal, that's your framework. So you're going to kind of continue with that, but there's an understanding there. I don't know if I like this idea that you can understand where the horror comes from. It's not, doesn't make it right, but you can
Right.
understand, like trauma, the perpetuation of some sort of abuse. It's very delicate topics, and I think horror tackles that so well sometimes, and you get that a lot through food as well, where you can really empathize. You get the single mum often. We saw that even in Megan now with the aunt who's kind of has this niece to look after, who doesn't have parents anymore, and they're at the table, and of course there's a slice of pizza. She's not going to make a meal from scratch. We have
Right.
the symbol of what it is to be a parent that can't deal with something, or a carer or a guardian. It's like, this is too much for me. You get pizza all the time, in many
Always
films.
pizza.
Always pizza. And it's like, sometimes you get a microwave, like in the film Ouija, and something bad's going to happen if you microwave a meal, because it means you
Hmm.
don't, in the idea of, like, in the filmic food world, it's like you're not taking care of yourself, so something's going to get you, some demon's going to get you now.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you a few questions that are kind of off the cuff. So the
Mhm.
first one is, if you had to choose a last meal, and it doesn't matter the context, I know that other podcasts will often give some kind of scenario or something like that. Let's say you got a bad review on your new book and you killed the critic. How about that? So what would you pick for your last meal?
I love Chinese food, and I'd go with my family. We always enjoy eating Chinese food at a restaurant in London, in North London. So that's where I go, 100%.
When I was living in England in the 80s, I used to really enjoy going to some of the older cemeteries, not new cemeteries, of course, but older cemeteries that had graves from, say, over 200 years ago, and have little picnics and stuff. They're always very pleasant places. Is there any graveyards in England that you would have a picnic in, if you could pick one?
Oh, well, there is the cemetery right by, kind of in East London, and Danny Boyle holds festivals there sometimes. He's a local, and yeah, I wouldn't mind having a picnic there. Why not? Kind of keep off, don't, I wouldn't go too far in, so then it gets a bit wild, but yeah.
If you could have a dinner party and have up to 12 or 13 characters from horror films at the dinner party, who would you invite?
That really wonderful looking lady from Insidious,
Yeah.
the woman in black. Most of the kind of Draculas around in any of the films, I like all of them. And this is debatable because it's a romance, really, but Jane Eyre I put in the Gothic section. It's kind of horrifying how Mr. Rochester behaves, but even though people think he's great,
Yeah.
so I'd put him in and poison him. And then I'd put Maxim as well, from Rebecca, who everyone thinks is great, but is just as horrifying as Mr. Rochester, I think. And then you've got to have Frankenstein's creature, because that would be
Yeah.
great fun. I'd sit him next to me, and we'd be vegetarian together. And then all the characters from The Haunting of Hill House. I mean, except maybe for Theodora, who's really annoying, but I love Mrs. Dudley and Mr. Dudley. And yeah, and then Mrs. Baylock from The Omen. I think, have I reached the number now?
Yeah.
Is it like
That sounds
the
great.
Last Supper, 13 people?
Yeah. Well, what would you serve? Pizza?
I think I'd serve for this dysfunctional family. Yeah, definitely pizza, which I love anyway.
Okay. So, what's next for you?
I am writing something else, and I'm always writing, and then we'll see what that becomes. Some projects I write and it doesn't turn into anything. They're just the beginning of something, and I will pick them up after a few years. But I have, from the academic point of view, I have a chapter coming out in the Palgrave edition of the Cultural Memory Anthology. So that should be out soon. And it's about Cuba and sugar. And it's about an author called Cristina Garcia. She's a Cuban American writer. And I analyze the the metaphors and symbols that are tied to sugar that she uses in her novels. She wrote a novel called Dreaming in Cuban in 1992, and it's been very influential when it comes to anything that I write, and also to how I see the world. So that should be out soon. I'm starting a podcast with Neil Buttery and Dr. Neil Buttery and Sam Bilton. It's going to be called A is for Apple podcast, and that should be out sometime, maybe before the end of the year or beginning of next year, but we're working hard on that. It's going to be an encyclopedia of food and drink, and we go through the alphabet letter by letter, and that's going to be
That
good
sounds
fun.
great. So, oh my
Yeah,
God, you two together, because I love Neil both. I mean, I love him. I love his work as well, and I love his podcast. So I can't wait to hear both of you on a podcast. That's going to be
that's going to be
wonderful.
good. And we've got Sam Bilton with us as well, who's a wonderful food historian. And yeah, it's going to be really, really good. So I really very much look forward to that.
I one last cheeky question, just because I'm very curious and nosy. What are you reading any good horror books right now?
Well, now I'm reading The Shining, but because we're going to be doing that in our haunted house. So you know that before anyone else
Yeah.
is. The Shining, and then I was reading Black Phone. The Black Phone. So I don't know if you watched the film.
No, not
It's
seen it yet.
based. Okay, so it's based on a short story. So I was reading that.
Oh wait, no, I have read. Listen, I did read that one. Sorry, yeah, I did. Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm reading that. Sometimes I really like short stories, so I'll read that. I did a talk on Horacio Quiroga and the Feather Pillow recently, and that's again on romancing the Gothic. So I love anything that's Latin American horror as well, and there's a lot coming out now, which is great. So Mariana Enriquez and other authors, it's great, and I can read them in Spanish because I can understand Spanish and speak Spanish, luckily. And it always makes a difference to like be able to read some things and then I can compare it to the English translation. I love doing that. I don't know why I love the comparison of things so much. It just gives me an insight into like the cultural differences. So that's, I think, why my obsession with that's where it stems from. And that's what I think makes Fear Feast so good as well. The idea that there is a difference between different forms of how you would produce and interpret a film or a book, and then you can find out more about what's happening in the world.
Excellent. Alessandra, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. It's been a real treat for me to get a chance to talk to you. So thank you for being on here. We're going to put links to your podcast, and that was my conversation with Alessandra Pino. We're going to have links to her book, The Gothic Cookbook, where you can pre-purchase it in the bio, as well as a link to her wonderful bi-weekly podcast, Fear Feast, which I enjoy very much. Next week, we'll be speaking with Kevin Geddes concerning his just recently out Keep Calm and Fanny On, The Many Careers of Fanny Craddock. I had a wonderful conversation with Kevin, and I love talking about the topic of food presenter Fanny Craddock. That'll be out next week. Until next week, I hope you're all having a wonderful summer, and I guess I'll see you at the library.